General Thomas Handy never forgot what he saw that April morning. Something about those women descending the gangplank made him question everything he thought he knew about victory. Spring of 1947 brought an unusual cargo to New York Harbor. The Marine Flasher, a converted troop transport that had carried soldiers across the Atlantic during the war, now carried a different kind of passenger. 47 Catholic nuns from Poland, Germany, Austria, and Hungary stepped onto American soil for the first time, carrying small suitcases and memories too heavy for any luggage. General Handy stood on the dock with other military officials, part of the coordination effort to receive displaced religious groups. The United States military had helped arrange passage for hundreds of European nuns through the National Catholic Welfare Conference, an organization working to relocate religious women whose convents had been destroyed or made uninhabitable by the war. This was supposed to be a routine arrival, another group of grateful immigrants beginning new lives in America. But nothing about that morning went as expected. Sister Maria Kowalska was among the first to descend. She had spent the war years running an underground orphanage in Warsaw, hiding children in basement shelters during bombardments, stretching single loaves of bread to feed dozens of hungry mouths. Her convent had been reduced to rubble in 1944. For 3 years after the war ended, she had lived in a displaced persons camp, continuing to care for orphans in conditions that would have broken most people. When her feet touched the dock, she looked up at the New York skyline. Buildings stood intact, reaching toward the sky without gaps where bombs had torn them apart. No rubble, no burned-out shells, no walls pockmarked with bullet holes. She stopped walking. The nuns behind her had to move around her as she stood frozen, staring at a city that hadn't been destroyed. General Handy noticed her reaction. He had prepared a brief welcome speech, something about American generosity and new beginnings. He never gave that speech. Sister Hildegard Müller came next, a German nun from Bavaria, whose order had operated a hospital throughout the war. She had set broken bones in hallways because the operating rooms had no roofs. She had held dying soldiers from both sides, whispering prayers in German and broken Russian and English. Her hands had been stained with blood for so many years that even now, scrubbed clean, she sometimes still saw it. She looked at the Americans on the dock. They were well-fed, their uniforms clean and pressed, their faces unmarked by the kind of exhaustion that comes from years of fear and hunger. Children played nearby, laughing, their cheeks round and healthy. She had not seen a child with round cheeks in 6 years. Sister Hildegard began to cry, not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. The other nuns gathered around her, but many of them were crying too. Sister Anna from Hungary, who had smuggled Jewish families across borders in the dead of night. Sister Therese from Austria, who had buried more people than she could count in mass graves behind her destroyed convent. Sister Catherine from Poland, who had watched Soviet soldiers execute 3 of her sister nuns for hiding resistance fighters. General Handy exchanged glances with the other officers. This was not the joyful reunion they had anticipated. These women were not celebrating their arrival in America. They looked traumatized, overwhelmed, almost frightened by what they were seeing. One of the younger officers approached Sister Maria, who still stood motionless on the dock. He spoke gently, asking if she needed assistance, if she was feeling ill. She turned to look at him, and he later reported that her eyes held something he had never seen before, not even in combat veterans. It was not just sadness. It was a kind of profound dislocation, as if she had stepped into a world that should not exist while the real world still burned. "Why is everything still standing?" she asked in halting English. "Why is nothing broken?" The officer did not know how to answer. To understand what happened that morning, you have to understand what these women had lived through. The Second World War had displaced more than 40 million people across Europe. Entire cities had been reduced to ruins. Warsaw, where Sister Maria had lived, had been systematically destroyed by German forces, with over 85% of its buildings demolished. Dresden, Berlin, Hamburg, Vienna, Budapest, all had suffered devastating bombardment. The physical destruction was almost incomprehensible in scale, but the nuns had not just witnessed destruction. They had worked in the midst of it, trying to maintain their missions of service and care while everything around them collapsed. Catholic convents and monasteries had played crucial roles during the war, often serving as hospitals, orphanages, and hiding places for refugees. Many religious orders had sheltered Jewish families, hidden resistance fighters, and provided medical care to wounded soldiers regardless of which side they fought for. The cost had been enormous. Hundreds of convents were destroyed. Thousands of nuns were killed, either in bombardments or executed for their resistance activities. Those who survived often found themselves in displaced persons camps after the war, their communities scattered, their life's work reduced to ash and memory. Sister Maria's story was typical. Her order, the Sisters of the Holy Family, had operated an orphanage and school in Warsaw's Praga district. When the war began in 1939, the convent became a refuge for children whose parents had been killed or taken away. By 1942, Sister Maria was caring for over 60 children in a building designed for 20. Food was scarce. Heat was scarce. Medicine was almost non-existent. During the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, the convent was hit by artillery fire. Sister Maria and the other nuns evacuated the children through the sewers, carrying the youngest ones on their backs through water and waste, emerging miles away in a part of the city not yet consumed by fighting. They lived in basements and ruins for months, constantly moving to stay ahead of the violence. When the war finally ended, Sister Maria found herself in a displaced persons camp with 17 surviving children. The convent was gone. Most of her sister nuns were dead. The Poland she had known no longer existed, now under Soviet control with a government hostile to religious institutions. The National Catholic Welfare Conference offered her a way out. Come to America. Continue your work in a Catholic orphanage in New York. She accepted, but leaving felt like abandonment. Thousands of children still needed help in Poland. Thousands of families were still displaced, still hungry, still suffering. How could she leave them to go to a country that, from everything she had heard, had barely been touched by the war? Sister Hildegard's journey had been different, but equally devastating. Her order, the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration, had run a hospital in Munich. When the war intensified, the hospital became a trauma center, receiving casualties from the Eastern Front and later from Allied bombing raids. Sister Hildegard had trained as a nurse before taking her vows, and her skills were desperately needed. She worked 20-hour shifts, performing amputations without anesthesia, treating burns with whatever material she could find, holding the hands of dying men who called out for their mothers in their final moments. The hospital was hit multiple times by bombs. Each time, the nuns would clear the rubble, patch the holes in the walls with whatever they could find, and continue working. By the time the war ended, Sister Hildegard was 32 years old, but looked 50. She had lost half her body weight. Her hands trembled constantly from exhaustion and trauma. The hospital was barely functional, lacking basic supplies, operating on donated materials and sheer determination. The post-war years were in some ways harder than the war itself. Germany was occupied, divided, its people struggling with collective guilt and individual survival. Food remained scarce. The hospital continued to operate, but now it treated people suffering from starvation, disease, and the psychological wounds of defeat. Sister Hildegard kept working, but she knew the situation was unsustainable. When the opportunity came to emigrate to America, to work in a well-supplied Catholic hospital in Chicago, she felt torn. Part of her wanted to stay, to continue serving the people who needed her most. But another part of her, the part that had been pushed beyond all reasonable limits, knew she could not survive much longer in Germany. She needed to leave, even if leaving felt like failure. Sister Anna's story involved even more direct danger. Her convent in Hungary had become a station on an underground railroad for Jewish families trying to escape deportation. Sister Anna, who spoke Hungarian, German, Yiddish, and some Russian, served as a guide leading families through forests and across borders in the middle of the night. She had been arrested twice by Hungarian fascist police but released both times due to her religious status and some well-placed bribes from sympathetic Catholics. After the war, Hungary fell under Soviet control. The new government was hostile to religious institutions, viewing them as potential centers of resistance. Several priests and nuns were arrested on fabricated charges. Sister Anna's convent was seized and converted into a government office building. She and her sister nuns were given 48 hours to leave. They scattered across Europe, some going to Austria, others to Italy, a few managing to reach France. Sister Anna ended up in a displaced persons camp in Austria, where she volunteered as a translator, helping refugees navigate the complex bureaucracy of post-war Europe. When the National Catholic Welfare Conference offered her passage to America, she accepted immediately. There was nothing left for her in Hungary. These 3 women, along with 44 others, boarded the Marine Flasher in early April 1947. The ship had been a troop transport during the war, carrying American soldiers to European battlefields. Now it carried the survivors back, though in a direction and for reasons no one had anticipated when the ship was built. The voyage across the Atlantic took 12 days. The nuns were housed in converted cargo holds, sleeping in bunks stacked 3 high, sharing limited bathroom facilities with hundreds of other passengers. The conditions were cramped but not unbearable, certainly better than what they had endured during the war. During the voyage, the nuns talked among themselves about what they expected to find in America. Most had only vague ideas, based on stories they had heard or propaganda they had seen. They knew America had not been bombed, that its cities remained intact, that food was more plentiful than in Europe, but they had no real concept of what that meant. Sister Maria imagined America would be like pre-war Poland, perhaps a bit more prosperous, but fundamentally similar. She expected to work in an orphanage that would be struggling with limited resources, where her experience stretching supplies and making do with very little would be valuable. Sister Hildegard thought American hospitals would be better equipped than German ones, but still operating under the constraints of post-war scarcity. She expected to find shortages of medicine, overworked staff, and the same kind of desperate improvisation she had practiced for years. Sister Anna assumed American Catholic institutions would be modest, focused on serving the poor and disadvantaged, operating with the kind of austere simplicity that characterized religious life in Europe. None of them were prepared for what they actually found. The Marine Flasher entered New York Harbor on April 23, 1947. It was a clear spring morning, unusually warm for the season. The Statue of Liberty appeared first, that iconic symbol they had all seen in photographs but never in person. Several of the nuns came up on deck to watch the approach, standing at the railing in their black habits, squinting against the bright sunlight. Sister Maria saw the statue and felt a strange disconnection. It looked exactly like the pictures, but seeing it in reality made it seem almost artificial, like a stage prop in a play about America, rather than something real. The statue represented freedom, liberty, new beginnings. But Sister Maria did not feel free. She felt like she was abandoning everyone she had left behind. As the ship moved closer to the dock, the New York skyline came into full view. Buildings rose impossibly high, their windows gleaming in the morning sun. No bomb damage, no collapsed structures, no gaps in the skyline where buildings had once stood. The city looked like it belonged to a different world, a world where war was something that happened in history books, rather than something that destroyed your home and killed your friends. Sister Hildegard gripped the railing so hard her knuckles turned white. She had seen photographs of American cities, but photographs could not convey the overwhelming reality of seeing an intact city after years of living among ruins. Munich had been beautiful once, with its grand architecture and historic buildings. Now it was a landscape of rubble and reconstruction, a city trying to remember what it had been. New York had never forgotten. New York had never needed to rebuild because New York had never been destroyed. The ship docked and the nuns prepared to disembark. They gathered their small suitcases, checked that their documents were in order, and formed a line to exit the ship. Military officials and representatives from the National Catholic Welfare Conference waited on the dock to receive them. General Handy stood with his fellow officers reviewing the paperwork one last time. This group of nuns would be distributed to various Catholic institutions across the Northeast, hospitals in New York and Philadelphia, schools in Boston and Baltimore, orphanages in several smaller cities. Everything had been arranged in advance. The nuns would be taken to temporary housing, given a few days to rest and adjust, then transported to their assigned locations. It should have been straightforward. It was anything but. Sister Maria was among the first group to descend the gangplank. She carried a single small suitcase that contained everything she owned, 2 changes of clothing, a rosary that had belonged to her mother, a prayer book, and a photograph of the children she had cared for in Warsaw. She walked slowly, carefully, her legs unsteady after 12 days at sea. When she reached the dock, she set down her suitcase and looked around. The first thing she noticed was the people. Americans walked past, going about their business, and they all looked so healthy. Their clothes were clean and intact, not patched and repatched like European clothing. Their faces were full, not hollowed by hunger. Children ran past, laughing and playing, and they moved with the careless energy of children who had always had enough to eat. Sister Maria had not seen children like that in 8 years. She stood motionless, watching them play, and something inside her broke. All the grief she had held back, all the trauma she had suppressed in order to keep functioning, came flooding out. She began to shake, her breath coming in short gasps, tears streaming down her face. An officer approached her, concerned, asking if she needed medical attention. She could not answer. She could only stand there crying, watching children play in a world that had not been destroyed. Sister Hildegard came down the gangplank next, and her reaction was similar. She saw the intact buildings, the well-dressed people, the casual abundance of a city that had never known bombardment, and she felt a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly knocked her down. She sat down right there on the dock, put her face in her hands, and sobbed. Other nuns gathered around her, but many of them were crying too. Sister Anna stood at the railing of the ship, not yet descended, looking at the scene below and feeling a sense of unreality so profound she wondered if she was dreaming. This could not be the same world where she had guided families through dark forests, where she had hidden in cellars while soldiers searched for her, where she had watched her convent be seized by a hostile government. But it was the same world. That was the problem. It was the same world, the same year, the same moment in history. While Europe had been torn apart, America had remained whole. While millions had starved, Americans had eaten. While cities burned, New York had kept its lights on. General Handy watched the nuns' reactions with growing alarm. This was not what he had expected. He had anticipated gratitude, relief, perhaps some tears of joy. Instead, he was witnessing something that looked more like trauma, like shell shock, like the reactions of soldiers who had seen too much combat. He approached Sister Maria, who had finally stopped shaking enough to stand upright. Through a translator, he asked if she was all right, if there was anything she needed. Sister Maria looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Why do you have so much?" she asked. "Why is everything here still standing? Don't you know what is happening in Europe? Don't you know that people are still dying?" The general did not know how to answer. Of course he knew what was happening in Europe. He had served in the war, had seen the destruction firsthand, but he had come home to an America that was intact, prosperous, moving forward. The war was over. America had won. Life went on. Except for these women, life had not gone on. For them, the war was not over. It lived in their memories, in their bodies, in the way they flinched at loud noises and hoarded food, and could not comprehend a world where buildings stood intact and children played without fear. The nuns were eventually loaded into buses that would take them to a Catholic retreat center in upstate New York, where they would spend a few days resting before being sent to their assigned locations. As the buses pulled away from the dock, Sister Maria looked out the window at the city passing by. She saw grocery stores with windows full of food, bakeries displaying bread and pastries, butcher shops with meat hanging in the windows, clothing stores with new dresses and suits, hardware stores with tools and supplies. Everything was available. Everything was abundant. Everything was there for anyone who had money to buy it. In Warsaw, people were still using ration cards. In Munich, Sister Hildegard's former hospital was still operating with donated supplies. In Budapest, Sister Anna's friends were still struggling to find enough food to survive. But here, in America, store windows overflowed with goods. Sister Maria watched an American woman exit a bakery, carrying a large bag of bread. The woman walked a few steps, then stopped and pulled out one of the loaves. She tore off a piece, ate it, then tossed the rest of the loaf into a trash can on the street corner. Sister Maria made a sound, a kind of strangled gasp. The nun sitting next to her, Sister Catherine, had seen it too. They looked at each other, unable to speak, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Someone had thrown away bread. Fresh bread, bread that could have fed a family. In Warsaw, Sister Maria had once stretched a single loaf of bread to feed 23 children. She had cut it into pieces so thin you could almost see through them, and the children had eaten every crumb, licking their fingers to capture any remaining fragments. And here, in America, someone had thrown bread away. The bus continued through the city, and the nuns saw more things that shocked them. A restaurant with a sign advertising an all-you-can-eat buffet, a department store with 5 floors of goods, a movie theater with bright lights and a line of people waiting to buy tickets for entertainment, for pleasure, for something that was not survival. Sister Hildegard stared at the movie theater and thought about the hospital in Munich, where they had no electricity for weeks at a time, where they performed surgeries by candlelight, where they reused bandages because there were no new ones available. Sister Anna saw a group of teenagers laughing and talking, carrying shopping bags from multiple stores, wearing new clothes and shoes that fit properly. She thought about the children she had guided through forests, children who wore shoes made from scraps of leather and cloth, children who had not laughed in years because there was nothing to laugh about. The disconnect was so profound it felt physical, like a weight pressing down on their chests. They had known, intellectually, that America had not been bombed, that American cities remained intact, but knowing something intellectually and experiencing it viscerally were completely different things. At the retreat center, the nuns were given rooms, 2 to a room, with clean beds and fresh linens. There was a dining hall where meals would be served 3 times a day. There was hot water for bathing. There was heat. There was electricity that worked all the time, not just a few hours a day. Sister Maria sat on her bed and looked around the room. It was simple, modest by American standards, but to her it seemed almost luxurious. A real bed with a real mattress, a window with glass that was not broken, a door that closed properly, a floor that was not covered in rubble. She thought about the displaced persons camp where she had lived for the past 2 years. Hundreds of people crammed into barracks designed for far fewer. Thin blankets that did not keep out the cold, food that was barely adequate, no privacy, no comfort, just survival, day after day, waiting for something to change. And now she was here, in this room, with this bed, and she felt like she had betrayed everyone she had left behind. Sister Hildegard had a similar reaction. She sat in the dining hall that evening, looking at the food that had been prepared for the nuns' first meal in America. There was roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread with butter, and apple pie for dessert. It was a simple meal by American standards, nothing fancy, just good home cooking. Sister Hildegard stared at her plate and could not eat. There was more food on this single plate than she had sometimes eaten in an entire week during the worst months of the war. The chicken was real meat, not the mysterious protein substitutes they had used in Germany. The bread was made from real wheat flour, not the sawdust extended versions they had baked in Munich. The butter was actual butter, not margarine or lard or whatever fat could be scraped together. She picked up her fork, cut a small piece of chicken and put it in her mouth. It tasted good. It tasted real. And that made her feel worse, not better. Around her, other nuns were having similar struggles. Some ate mechanically, forcing themselves to consume the food because they knew they needed it. Others could not eat at all, pushing their plates away, overwhelmed by guilt and grief. A few ate ravenously, their bodies responding to the availability of food, even as their minds struggled with the moral implications. Sister Anna ate slowly, methodically, but she was thinking about something else entirely. She was thinking about a family she had guided across the Hungarian border in 1944. The Goldsteins, a mother, father, and 3 children, the youngest only 4 years old. They had walked for 3 nights through forests and fields, hiding during the day, moving only in darkness. The children had been so hungry, and Sister Anna had only a small amount of bread to share among them. The youngest child, Sarah, had cried from hunger. Her mother had tried to comfort her, but there was no comfort to give. They had no food, they had no safety. They had only the hope that if they kept moving, they might survive. Sister Anna had given Sarah her last piece of bread. It was not enough. It was never enough. But it was all she had. Now, sitting in this dining hall in America, looking at a table full of food, Sister Anna wondered what had happened to the Goldsteins. Had they survived? Had they made it to safety? Or had they been caught, deported, murdered like so many others? She would never know, and that not knowing was its own kind of torture. After dinner, the nuns gathered in a common room for evening prayers. They recited familiar words, prayers they had said thousands of times, prayers that had sustained them through the darkest moments of the war. But tonight, the prayers felt hollow. How could they thank God for their blessings when so many others were still suffering? How could they ask for daily bread when they had just eaten more food than most Europeans would see in a week? Sister Maria tried to pray, but the words would not come. Instead, she found herself thinking about the children she had left behind in Poland. 17 of them had survived the war under her care, but there had been so many more. So many who had died from hunger, from disease, from bombs, from bullets. She had buried children with her own hands, digging graves in frozen ground, whispering prayers over small bodies wrapped in whatever cloth she could find. And now she was here, safe, well-fed, in a country that had never known that kind of suffering. The guilt was overwhelming. Back in New York, General Handy sat in his office writing a report about the day's events. He was supposed to file a routine summary of the nuns' arrival, confirming that they had been received and transported to the retreat center without incident. But he found himself writing something different. The emotional state of these women is far more complex than anticipated, he wrote. They are not simply grateful refugees beginning new lives. They are traumatized individuals who have witnessed and experienced horrors that most Americans cannot comprehend. Their reaction to American prosperity is not joy, but profound distress. They seem to view our abundance as somehow obscene in light of the continued suffering in Europe. He paused, reading over what he had written. It sounded critical of the nuns, which was not his intention. He tried again. What I witnessed today has forced me to reconsider my understanding of the war's impact. We Americans speak of victory, of triumph, of a war well won. But these women remind us that victory has a cost that extends far beyond the battlefield. They have paid that cost in ways we have not. They have lost homes, communities, and in many cases, their sense of purpose. Coming to America, rather than offering relief, seems to have intensified their sense of dislocation and guilt. He stopped writing and sat back in his chair. He had served in Europe during the war, had seen the destruction firsthand, but he had always viewed it from the perspective of an American soldier, someone who would eventually go home to a country that remained intact. He had never considered what it would be like to have no intact home to return to arrive in America and realize that while you suffered, Americans had continued living normal lives. The nuns' reactions had revealed something uncomfortable about American triumphalism. The United States had won the war, yes, but it had won from a position of geographic privilege. No American cities had been bombed. No American civilians had starved. American children had continued going to school, playing in parks, growing up in safety. Europeans had not had that luxury. And now, when European refugees came to America seeking safety, and the opportunity to continue their work. They were confronted with a level of prosperity that seemed almost offensive in its casualness. General Handy finished his report, but he knew it would not be well received. His superiors wanted simple narratives about grateful immigrants and American generosity. They did not want complicated stories about trauma and guilt and the moral implications of geographic privilege. But he filed the report anyway, because what he had witnessed that day deserved to be documented, even if it made people uncomfortable. Over the next few days, the nuns remained at the retreat center, supposedly resting and adjusting before being sent to their assigned locations. But rest was difficult. Many of them could not sleep, lying awake in comfortable beds, thinking about people who had no beds at all. Others had nightmares, reliving moments from the war, waking up disoriented and frightened. The staff at the retreat center tried to help, but they did not really understand what the nuns were experiencing. They offered comfort and reassurance, talking about how lucky the nuns were to be in America now, how they could start fresh, how they could put the war behind them. But the nuns could not put the war behind them. The war was not behind them. It was inside them, woven into their memories and their bodies and their understanding of the world. Sister Catherine, one of the Polish nuns, tried to explain it to one of the American staff members. "You think we are sad because of what we lost," she said in halting English. "But that is not it. We are sad because we are here and they are there. We are sad because we have food and they are hungry. We are sad because we are safe and they are not. We are sad because we left them behind." The staff member nodded sympathetically but did not really understand. How could she? She had never had to make that choice, had never had to decide between her own survival and her commitment to others. On the third day, representatives from the various Catholic institutions came to meet the nuns and escort them to their new assignments. Sister Maria was assigned to an orphanage in Brooklyn. Sister Hildegard would go to a hospital in Chicago. Sister Anna was assigned to a school in Philadelphia. They said goodbye to each other, these women who had shared a journey across the Atlantic, who had experienced the shock of arrival together. They promised to write, to stay in touch, to support each other as they navigated this strange new world. Sister Maria arrived at the orphanage in Brooklyn on a warm spring afternoon. The building was large and well-maintained, with a playground in the back where children were playing. She could hear their laughter from the street. The Mother Superior greeted her warmly, showing her around the facility. There were dormitories with real beds, a dining hall with a full kitchen, classrooms with books and supplies, a chapel for daily prayers. Everything was clean, organized, functional. "We care for 42 children currently," the Mother Superior explained. "Most are here because their parents cannot care for them, either due to poverty, illness, or other circumstances. We provide them with food, shelter, education, and religious instruction. Our goal is to eventually reunite them with their families when possible, or find them adoptive homes." Sister Maria nodded, taking it all in. 42 children. In Warsaw, she had cared for more than 60 in a space half this size, with a fraction of the resources. Here, each child had their own bed. There was enough food for 3 meals a day. There were toys and books and a playground. It should have made her happy. Instead, it made her feel empty. That evening, she sat down to write a letter to the displaced persons camp in Poland, to the people she had left behind. She tried to describe America, tried to explain what she had seen, but the words felt inadequate. How could she tell them about the abundance, the waste, the casual prosperity? How could she explain that Americans threw away food, that store windows overflowed with goods, that children here had never known hunger? She wrote several drafts, crossing out sentences, starting over. Finally, she settled on something simple. "I have arrived safely in America. The work here is good, and I am grateful for the opportunity to continue serving. But I miss you all terribly, and I pray for you every day. Please know that you are not forgotten." It was not enough. It could never be enough. But it was all she could offer. Sister Hildegard had a similar experience in Chicago. The hospital where she was assigned was modern, well-equipped, and fully staffed. There were X-ray machines, sterilization equipment, abundant supplies of medicine and bandages, and enough nurses and doctors to work reasonable shifts. On her first day, the head nurse showed her the supply room. Shelves lined with bottles of medicine, boxes of bandages, surgical instruments, syringes, everything a hospital could need. "We order supplies monthly," the head nurse explained. "If we run low on anything, we just place an order and it arrives within a week." Sister Hildegard stared at the shelves. In Munich, they had operated with whatever they could scrounge. They had reused bandages, boiling them to sterilize them, using them until they literally fell apart. They had performed surgeries with instruments that were worn and outdated. They had rationed medicine so carefully that patients often received less than the recommended dose because there simply was not enough to go around. And here, in Chicago, if they ran low on supplies, they just ordered more. The head nurse noticed Sister Hildegard's expression. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Sister Hildegard shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "Nothing is wrong. Everything is right. That is the problem." The head nurse did not understand, and Sister Hildegard did not try to explain. Sister Anna's experience in Philadelphia was equally disorienting. The school where she was assigned was a large Catholic elementary school, serving several hundred children from working-class families. The building was old but well-maintained, with classrooms, a library, a gymnasium, and a cafeteria. Sister Anna was assigned to teach English and history to 5th and 6th graders. On her first day, she stood in front of a classroom of 30 children, all of them clean, well-fed, wearing decent clothes and shoes that fit. They looked at her with curiosity, these American children who had never known war, who had never gone hungry, who had never hidden in basements while bombs fell overhead. She tried to teach them about European history, about the war, about the importance of understanding the world beyond America's borders. But she could see in their eyes that they did not really understand. To them, the war was something that had happened far away, something their fathers or older brothers had fought in, something that was over now. They could not comprehend what it meant to live through a war, to have your home destroyed, to watch people you loved die, to spend years in a state of constant fear and deprivation. And Sister Anna realized that she could not teach them that. She could tell them facts and dates and names, but she could not make them understand what it felt like. The gap between their experience and hers was too vast. Back in New York, General Handy continued to think about the nuns' arrival. He found himself talking about it with other officers, trying to articulate what had disturbed him so much about that day. "They made me realize something," he told a colleague over drinks one evening. "We talk about winning the war, about American strength and courage. And all of that is true. But we won from a position of safety. Our cities were never bombed. Our children were never hungry. We sent soldiers to fight, and many of them died. And that was a terrible cost. But the civilian population here never experienced what European civilians experienced." His colleague nodded. "That's true. But isn't that a good thing? Isn't that what we were fighting for, to protect American civilians from that kind of suffering?" "Yes," General Handy said. "But it also means we don't really understand what we're asking of these refugees. We expect them to be grateful, to be happy to be here. And they are grateful in a way. But they're also traumatized and guilty and dislocated. They're here in body, but part of them is still back in Europe, still trying to help people who need help." The conversation stayed with him. He began to see the nuns' arrival as emblematic of a larger issue. The United States was emerging from the war as a global superpower, with enormous economic and military strength. But that strength came partly from the fact that American territory had been spared the destruction that had devastated Europe and Asia. Americans had not earned their prosperity through superior virtue or harder work. They had been lucky, geographically lucky, to be separated from the main theaters of war by vast oceans. The nuns reminded him of that luck and of the responsibility that came with it. In the months that followed, the nuns began to adapt to their new lives in America. They learned English, or improved the English they already knew. They learned American customs and ways of doing things. They became part of the institutions where they worked, contributing their skills and experience. but they never fully adjusted to the abundance. Sister Maria continued to be shocked by waste, by the casual way Americans discarded food and goods that could still be used. She began collecting things that others threw away, repairing them, finding ways to use them. The other nuns at the orphanage thought she was being overly frugal, but Sister Maria could not help herself. Throwing things away felt like a sin when she knew how desperately people in Europe needed those same things. She also began organizing relief efforts, collecting donations from the parish to send back to Poland. She wrote letters describing the conditions in displaced persons camps, the ongoing need for food and medicine and clothing. Some parishioners responded generously, moved by her descriptions. Others seemed annoyed, as if she was asking them to care about problems that were no longer their concern. "The war is over," one parishioner told her. "We need to move on, focus on our own communities." Sister Maria wanted to scream at him that the war was not over, not for millions of people who were still displaced, still hungry, still suffering. But she held her tongue, smiled politely, and thanked him for his time. Sister Hildegard had a different struggle. Working in a well-equipped hospital should have been a relief after years of desperate improvisation in Munich. But instead, she found herself almost paralyzed by the abundance of resources. She would stand in the supply room, staring at shelves full of medicine, unable to decide what to use because she was so accustomed to rationing, to making every dose count. The other nurses noticed her hesitation and tried to help. "You don't need to be so careful," one of them said kindly. "We have plenty, use what you need." But Sister Hildegard could not shake the habit of scarcity. She continued to ration supplies, to reuse things that could be reused, to save and conserve in ways that seemed unnecessary in an American hospital. She also struggled with the types of cases she saw. In Munich, she had treated life-threatening injuries and illnesses, people who would die without immediate intervention. Here in Chicago, she treated those cases too, but she also treated people with minor ailments, people who came to the hospital for things that would have been considered trivial in war-torn Europe. A woman came in complaining of a headache. A man wanted treatment for a sprained ankle. A child had a minor cut that needed bandaging. Sister Hildegard treated them all professionally, but inside she felt a growing sense of disconnection. These people did not know how lucky they were, how minor their problems were compared to what people in Europe faced every day. Sister Anna's struggle was more philosophical. Teaching American children about history and the world, she found herself constantly confronting their lack of understanding about life beyond America's borders. They knew facts, dates, names, events, but they had no real comprehension of what those facts meant in human terms. She tried to bridge that gap, telling them stories from her own experience, describing what life had been like during the war. But she had to be careful, had to edit her stories to make them appropriate for children. And in the editing, much of the truth was lost. She could not tell them about the families she had guided through forests, about the fear in their eyes, about the children who cried from hunger. She could not describe the executions she had witnessed, the bodies she had seen, the casual brutality of war. So she told sanitized versions, and the children listened politely, and she knew they did not really understand. One day, a student asked her, "Why did you leave Europe if you miss it so much?" Sister Anna paused, considering how to answer. "I left because I had to," she said finally, "because staying was no longer possible. But leaving does not mean forgetting, does not mean stopping to care about the people I left behind." The student nodded, but Sister Anna could see she did not really grasp what that meant. General Handy, meanwhile, found that his experience with the nuns had changed his perspective on post-war policy. He became an advocate for increased aid to Europe, arguing that the United States had a moral obligation to help rebuild what the war had destroyed. He testified before congressional committees considering the Marshall Plan, the massive aid program proposed to help European recovery. He spoke about the nuns he had met, about their reactions to American prosperity, about what their trauma revealed about the true cost of war. "These women served heroically during the war," he told one committee. "They saved lives, sheltered refugees, maintained hope in the darkest times. And now they are here in America, and they cannot reconcile our abundance with the suffering they left behind. That should tell us something. That should remind us that the war's consequences are not over just because the fighting has stopped. His testimony was noted but not widely publicized. The Marshall Plan passed for many reasons: strategic concerns about Soviet expansion, economic interests in rebuilding European markets, genuine humanitarian concern. The Nuns story was a small part of a much larger narrative, but for General Handy, it remained significant. He never forgot that April morning on the dock, watching women cry at the sight of an intact city, watching them struggle to comprehend a world where buildings stood and children played and food was abundant. Years later, he would write in his memoirs, "I thought I understood what we had fought for. I thought I understood what victory meant. But those nuns taught me that victory is more complicated than I had realized. We won the war, but we did so from a position of privilege that most of the world did not share. And that privilege came with responsibilities we were only beginning to understand." The nuns themselves continued their work in America, serving in hospitals and schools and orphanages, contributing to American Catholic institutions in countless ways. They adapted, learned, and built new lives. But they never forgot where they came from, and they never stopped working to help those they had left behind. Sister Maria eventually brought several orphans from Poland to America, sponsoring their immigration and finding them homes with Catholic families. Sister Hildegard founded a relief organization that sent medical supplies to hospitals in Germany. Sister Anna created a scholarship fund for Hungarian refugees, helping them access education and opportunities in their new country. They found ways to bridge the gap between their two worlds, to use American resources to help European needs, to turn their guilt and grief into productive action. But the shock never fully faded. Even decades later, Sister Maria would sometimes stop in front of a grocery store window, staring at the abundance, remembering the children in Warsaw who had been so hungry. Even decades later, Sister Hildegard would carefully conserve supplies, unable to break the habits formed during years of scarcity. Even decades later, Sister Anna would try to teach her students about the world beyond America, hoping that somehow she could make them understand. The story of these nuns is not widely known. It is a small footnote in the larger narrative of post-war immigration, a minor detail in the massive displacement and resettlement of millions of people after World War II. But it reveals something important about that historical moment. It shows the profound disconnect between American experience of the war and European experience. It demonstrates the psychological cost of survival, the guilt that comes with being saved while others continue to suffer. It illustrates the complexity of immigration, the way that coming to a new country can be both a relief and a trauma. Most importantly, it reminds us that victory in war is not simple or clean. The United States won World War II, but that victory was built on geographic luck as much as military prowess. American cities were never bombed. American civilians were never starved. American children continued to grow up in safety. Europeans did not have that luxury. And when European refugees came to America after the war, they brought with them a perspective that challenged American triumphalism, that forced Americans to confront the true cost of the war they had won. General Handy understood that, standing on the dock that April morning, watching nuns cry at the sight of an intact city, he understood that their tears were not tears of joy, but tears of grief. Grief for what had been lost, grief for those left behind, grief for a world that had been destroyed while America remained whole. That understanding changed him. It made him question assumptions he had never thought to question before. It made him realize that winning a war and understanding a war are two very different things. The nuns taught him that lesson, not through words but through their reactions, through their inability to celebrate what Americans took for granted, through their profound sense of dislocation in a land of plenty. It was a lesson that more Americans needed to learn then, and perhaps need to learn still. The lesson that prosperity is not earned solely through virtue, that safety is often a matter of luck, that those who have been spared suffering have obligations to those who have not. The nuns knew that lesson intimately. They had lived it, breathed it, carried it with them across the Atlantic. And when they arrived in America, they brought that knowledge with them, a gift that Americans were not quite ready to receive. But General Handy received it. He understood what their shock revealed, what their tears meant, what their grief taught. He never forgot those women descending the gangplank, carrying their small suitcases and their enormous burdens. He never forgot the way they looked at America, not with gratitude alone, but with a complex mixture of relief and guilt and profound moral discomfort. He never forgot that sometimes the most important lessons come not from victory, but from witnessing how others experience that victory, from seeing your triumph through the eyes of those who paid a price you never had to pay. That April morning in 1947, 47 nuns arrived in New York Harbor and shocked a general into understanding something he had never fully grasped before. They showed him that the war was not over, not really, not for millions of people who still suffered its consequences. They showed him that American abundance was not normal, not universal, not something to be taken for granted. They showed him that victory has a cost that extends far beyond the battlefield, a cost paid by civilians and refugees and displaced persons who lost everything while Americans lost comparatively little. And in showing him that, they gave him a gift, the gift of perspective, the gift of understanding, the gift of moral clarity about what America owed to a world it had helped to save, but had not fully shared in suffering. It was a gift he carried with him for the rest of his life, a reminder that sometimes the most profound truths come not from triumph, but from witnessing the trauma of those who survived what you were spared. If you found this story as powerful as I did, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more untold histories like this one. Hit the like button if this moved you, and leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on these brave women's journey. Your support helps me bring more forgotten stories to light.